Deputy County Counsel.
Berkeley Brannon, Chief Assistant, representing District Attorney Dean Flippo.
Susan Chapman, Public Defender.
Elliot Robinson, Director of Social Services.
Robin McCrae, Community Human Services.
Thank you. Are there any additions or corrections to the agenda?
Let the record reflect there were no additions or corrections to the agenda.
Thank you. Because this is a special meeting, I'll now take public comments, but the comments need to be limited to the items on the agenda only. Are there any public comments? Seeing none, we'll go right into our first scheduled item, which is an update on the tier system. As you remember, I believe last CCP meeting we talked about a tool that we found in Sonoma County to kind of structure the priorities for funding. And I think we were unable to come to a consensus about whether to adopt that at that meeting. So in the meantime, I'll ask Director Hatton to give an update on that.
I thought I would take the opportunity to sort of back up a little and explain why it's difficult to adopt any kind of a system that would prioritize our funding, and just give you a little bit of background information, so I'll be brief. So there's a couple of general areas that you would look at when you, or that I would think that you would look at when you're considering spending AB 109 money. The first one is really the biggest, it's recidivism. The ultimate measure in outcomes is recidivism, and the very creation of public safety realignment had to do with reducing the number of inmates in state prison and reducing the number of inmates that return to state prison for violations of their parole. The problem with using recidivism for our structure of funding or prioritizing funding is that not all things can be measured in terms of recidivism. One example of that would be the nurse in the jail. There's no way to tie whether or not providing medical care is any relationship to the recidivism. And for those things that can be measured and analyzed for a relationship with recidivism rates, we don't have the data yet. I know you guys hear that a lot from us. This is the direction we are headed, but the progress is slow, and with program participation in ETO and conviction data from the court, we will try to achieve matching the data in order to be able to show programs or any combination of programs that seem to have a relationship with recidivism, but that's definitely down the road in the future. We're still kind of trying to build the infrastructure of that, so we're definitely not there yet. The next primary way that you would consider utilizing AB 109 funds would be based on program outcomes. We can measure a participant's outcome and overall outcomes for each program. That is what we did in the reports that we created recently that we gave to you. One of them was program budget and performance data, and then we also gave you the first annual service delivery report, and those were about program outcomes. The problem with just using that is that these outcomes are not tied back to recidivism at all. And we have not measured program outcomes before, so we do not know yet what the standard for success will be. What percentage should be a good percentage for offenders to successfully complete a program? What does a good rate look like for a resistant high-risk population? What we do know about programs is that if they are evidence-based, they do reduce recidivism, and that the number of CBT hours an offender is exposed to can also reduce their rate of recidivism. So we know those basic things about programs, but we would have to know that we have programs implemented that truly are evidence-based and that that's been measured. And then again, we have to figure out a way to tie it back to recidivism. But then not all programs lend themselves to outcome measures. Examples of that would be jail staff or infrastructure costs. So there would still need to be a way to identify needed services for funding that don't lend themselves to outcome measures. So that takes care of making decisions based on recidivism and program outcomes. The third big one is population served. We could prioritize or limit funding to items that are solely directed at realigned offenders, but the problem with that is that not all funding supports only realigned offenders. So how do you limit services that are provided to a blended population of realigned and non-realigned offenders? Again, the nurse is a good example for that. We know that a nurse was needed in the jail because people are no longer coming in and out of the jail only up to 1 year. People are sentenced to the jail for several years now. So we need to address the fact that there's going to be an increase in healthcare needs. But would we reduce the service or priority of that because the nurse would likely see other offenders that were not realigned? Another example is that high-risk intensive supervision probationers have access to some of the AB 109 funded programs, and some programs do not target realigned offenders at all. And examples of that would be our pretrial program, and the decision-making behind that was that they were alternatives to custody. So you can see it's kind of no great fit. It's all over the place. There's 1,000 things to consider. So I just wanted to offer to you sort of a, where do you want to go from here? We can continue to make decisions by evaluating each item without any formal framework, as we have been doing. We can wait until we have more evidence to show outcomes. Or, if you still are interested in adopting a set of criteria that will be applied for future funding and cuts, then you can decide how you want to proceed to try and accomplish that.
Thank you. We have
Any
comments or questions from the board?
Yeah, if I can, Chair, the theory of the basic theory behind having a tier system, I think, is twofold. One is it provides some kind of structure to talk about, the prioritizing future spending, but perhaps more importantly, if we get to where we're having to cut, it could provide criteria for making those budget cut decisions. The difficulty is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a system that allows you to prioritize budget items from different departments. And I agree with what Nancy has said. If you're looking at what a psychiatric social worker does, and you're comparing that to what a probation officer 2 does, and you're trying to compare that to what a victim advocate does, and you're trying to compare that to what a custodial officer does, and you're trying to say which is 1, 2, 3, 4. First of all, it's a matter of opinion. It's not knowable, and to try and create a philosophical document that does this is beyond the scope of us two on the subcommittee. So what normally happens, and I think county government is a good model for us. The county doesn't try to prioritize particular functions across departments. I mean, the board may make a decision that this particular department's going to take a bigger cut at some point. But we don't have a rating system that says a deputy DA is worth this and a county admin officer is worth that. Nobody does that. It's not because it's a matter of opinion, and they actually have different functions, completely disparate functions. So I think that I appreciate what Sonoma tried to do, but I think my understanding of what they did, and I think this is a problem, and I'll shut up. If you're trying to tether this, the only logical thing you could do, it seems to me, is you would just tether the whole thing to what did realignment transfer to us. But as we move forward 5 years from now, and we're 10 years away from what realignment transferred to us, that almost becomes a happenstance. And we may not want to spend more money on 1170H offenders than we spend on serious and violent offenders, as an example, whether it's supervision or whether it's custody or whether it's treatment. It doesn't make sense, and we are not restrained that way. No CCP is. We don't have to spend the money on just PRCS and 1170H folks, which is what realignment brought to us. So it's my view that we should not adopt a tier system. I think that when we get to budget cutting time, if that occurs, we have to make a decision as to how to proceed. I know what the county does. They would say, you've got a 10% cut, and each department's going to have a cut, and you work out how you want to meet that obligation. And I think this was a way to try to find a different way to do that, but I don't think it's possible.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments, and I totally agree with you. Other comments from the board?
Just a comment, though, kind of the value, not as, you know, there is a value for, to establish a framework to have the discussion. And I don't think it's, to call it to presume an outcome from that discussion, I think, like you said, Burke, that's hard. But, I mean, there's the idea of what's mandated, what's discretionary, for example, is something that we would look at, which is part of the tiered system. So, I'm comfortable not adopting it, but I do think kind of at the analytic framework, if we get to the point of, certainly the point of reductions, having some sort of framework to categorize the types of expenditures and decisions, it has value.
Yeah, and the only thing I would say, I understand that from a philosophical standpoint, the creation of it, how you'll go about doing that is very difficult. I mean, it's really a question for the board to agree on, and then how you grapple with that, you could create a subcommittee and take a run at it. But it's an idea that that has appeal, but it's also difficult to create the framework that you're imagining.
Yeah, and to tie your decision to that framework becomes even harder. But to kind of look at it as a lens is where there is some value.
Thank you. Any further comments? This is a non-action item, so we won't take any action. And we'll move on to the next item. So after the last CCP meeting, the probation department internally started working on its own budget. And as part of that process, we looked at caseloads and the counts. And what we discovered was that our PRCS caseloads were running about 5760, is that correct? And we really felt that that was too high. And so we are asking for a DPO for our adult division to lower those caseloads to a reasonable amount and an amount that's really recommended by the evidence. And that would be, correct me if I'm wrong, 50 for PRCS?
50 for moderate to high risk.
Right. And then around 20 for the very, very high?
Yes.
Yes. So that is our augmentation request. I'm sorry that it's late, but it really was not discovered until after the last CCP meeting when the baseline budget was adopted. So I'll take board comments. Chief Masterson, I know that you wish to make a comment, please.
Everybody always looks at me when we talk about this, and I'm the newest member on the board. Well, minus you. I just express my further caution that in a time of unsure budgets, just adding positions just because you have the fiscal reserves is not a smart way of doing business, in my opinion. With that being said, I'd also say I totally understand that with the PCRS you want the higher supervision, so I can understand the need for it, but I just caution that eventually we're just talking about a tier system and how that's going to be effective potentially for cuts down the road, and here we are spending reserves and adding positions to a budget that's already over what we're anticipating as income. So that's all I'm going to say on the matter.
Chief, do you have a comment?
Thank you, Chair. If I could, we talked about this, we heard some about this last week. We just talked about it in light, talking about the tier system and priorities. And clearly, we all know what these trend lines look like as far as what the anticipated revenues are, which way they're headed, which way our ongoing expenditures are headed. I appreciate the Chief's comments. We are, every time we had an ongoing cost, it's something that we may have to deal with down the road. But knowing what the Probation and Parole Association suggests, knowing that that the offenders probation's dealing with are people that they need supervision. We need these people supervised while they're out in our community, and we are very fortunate right now that we have some reserves, And I think as long as we're paying close attention and we don't want to get to the point where we're right to the edge of the cliff before we make hard decisions and have to unwind some of these things that we're doing. But I think that the position's necessary, and I say that knowing that we're headed on a trend line where we may have to make some hard decisions moving forward.
Thank you.
Wanted to comment that I think that the whole idea of trying to have intensive supervision for our very at-risk clients, the more supervision they have, the higher degree of success I think they'll achieve. And so although it may be money going out in the short term, hopefully in a year or two, we've made an effective impact on these individuals so they don't come back into the system and cost us even more.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the comments are excellent, and I do appreciate, Chief Masterson's observations. And one thing I would say is, last year, we actually underspent our budget by $2 million. We've got a $7 million reserve right now. We're spending projected $13.5 million, which is moving forward, assuming that we don't get any additional revenues, we'd be $1 million over per year. On the other hand, in 14-15, our revenues were from the state were $9.5 million. They went up last year almost $2 million, a little short of that, 1.7. So I don't know what the revenues are going to be, but I think with the reserve that we have, I think this is a prudent expenditure and a prudent budget at this point. If it turns out that revenues don't change, then in a number of years that will end up not, we'll end up having to cut. But the trend line from 11-12 to 15-16 has been increase in revenues virtually every year. I mean, it's gone up from $4 million to $12 million, and I'm not convinced that it isn't going to keep going up some. And I think with our reserve, it's a prudent budget.
Thank you. Any further comments? Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second? Second. Any other further discussion? Seeing none, we'll have a vote. All those in favor say aye.
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 Oppose? Abstain? Thank you. We'll move on to our last scheduled item, and that is, what are we going to do next? And I would ask Management Analyst Marissa Fiore to come up and give a short presentation.
We are at the ready. Thank you, Chief. CCP member, good afternoon. We don't have a staff report for item C because it will be a topic for discussion by the CCP, but I was thinking about presenting a quick recap, some of the concepts that you have already addressed, to kind of give a background to the discussion. So the fiscal year 17-18 budget is being presented and approved by the CCP as part of the budget package that the County Board of Supervisors will vote on in June. And all the recommended services being funded, including the last motion that you have approved. And it's also been presented to you that in fiscal year 17-18, we're right-sizing the budget and restructuring the budget so that is coming closer to actual expenditures. And consequently, we're going to have more accurate fund balance expenditures. The actual fund balance is given and calculated the September following the end of the fiscal year, when all the expenditures are accounted for. So those are the actual numbers. But we can now project 5 to 7 million in range, like Berkeley was saying, at the end of the current fiscal year. And this is in addition to the reserve that you have established by policy of about 1.8 million. So the question is now what the CCP wishes to do in managing this fund balance. And it's projected, and I think that is the document that Berkeley was reviewing and that you receive quarterly, where we try to update what these balances are. But it is projected, like Chief Masterson said, that our allocations are going to be lower than our expenditures in the future from 17-18 on. And so since our budget to start with is going to be more realistic, they will start eroding this balance. We're going to have to take portion out of the fund balance to meet the budget. And it's going to be more rapid if additional services are added each year. So that's what we know right now. These projections can be either positively or negatively impacted by the actual revenues, particularly for the growth fund, which is on top of what the percent allocation is guaranteed by Constitution amendment, although that is a percentage, so it's still based on the economy and the revenue that funds it. So our fiscal picture is still changing, will be changing, but we're trying to get closer and closer to reality as much as we can. So at this point, and by this point I mean fiscal year 17-18 on, there is an opportunity to plan and to establish strategies to appropriately steward these funds. And so one option that maybe the CCP can entertain is to create an ad hoc committee of staff that could propose some fiscal options. These could be spending strategies. Do we want to spend, not spend, spend a portion, have a gradual expenditures, having no expenditures at all? Or discuss and present gaps in services, areas of need as subject matter experts in their field, or as collecting from the CCP members, and compile all this information in a report to the board with options that address fiscal element as well as programs or needs. So it's for consideration by your board, for discussion by your board, and I remain available if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Have any ideas from the board?
So, Marcia, is this kind of the concept is that as chair, you could name an ad hoc committee, perhaps to consider both funding and programmatic opportunities and threats?
That's correct.
But there's no kind of right now we don't have an analysis on needs or gaps in services for adult offenders. Or at least we're not talking about it, right? We don't have it available right now.
That's
Okay.
right.
Okay.
So,
I mean, if you were to have one, I'd be happy to participate.
thank you. So, Marissa, how do you see this working? If we had some volunteer members from CCP to be on this committee, how do you envision this going forward?
We're discussing, we're opening to opinions, but one option would be to have staff in the departments or the agencies that are part of the CCP that could come together and start discussing some options that could be compiled in a report and presented to the board. So that would be an ad hoc committee. It's specific to a topic, is limited in time. So I defer to council, but based on the code for the Brown Act it is not subject to Brown Act activities. It's just gathering information to be presented actually here in an option format so that the CCP could have things to discuss. That could be a way to approach it. And as I was mentioning, this group could address and put together information about fiscal element as well as needs element. And of course, the CCP members are welcome to express some of the needs if they see them, to be represented by this group in the report, and that there will be some feedback given to this body. Now, probation is the lead agency, so we are in the mode of organizing. We can get it going. We can contact you for your determination of who you would like to have in this group. All options.
Thank
We
you.
were brainstorming ourselves.
Does county council want to weigh in on this at all, as far as the Brown Act issue?
From what I'm understanding, she's proposing something in the form of like a stakeholder type meeting where select people would participate. It wasn't clear to me though, would you allow the public to also participate or would it be a closed meeting?
No, we were envisioning a staff meeting to collect information because the place for discussion and evaluation of options would be the CCP meeting. So it's just collecting information.
So for instance, if Elliot would like to participate, he would delegate a staff from his department to
It's not a
participate.
legislative body, this
Yeah.
ad hoc committee, and therefore that's, in the reading of the Brown Act, doesn't fit the definition of legislative body, but
Right. In general, as long as you don't have a majority of the members
Yes.
of the board, then, or
Yeah.
of this committee, then you should be fine with the Brown Act.
yeah. So potentially, according to council and according to the reading of that section, a few of you members could also participate if you wish to do so, as long as there is no majority. But we thought maybe staff level, because we're involved in operations, can come up with recommendations, take in consideration your feedback, repackage it so they can be compiled and presented to you, who still has to discuss it and decide, because that is your role in the public meeting,
So the plan would be to present it at the May meeting?
if you wish to.
Or
do so.
thereafter.
Or-
Does that sound agreeable? Elliot, did I hear you volunteer?
Yeah, but if it's at the staff level, I don't know that I would have kind of staff at the, kind of with the right breadth, but either, however you want to structure it.
Okay.
I think that kind of the mixture between program and finance is always just personally
Okay,
interesting.
sounds good, yeah. Robin, would you like to volunteer?
Sure, I can do that, and I had a comment or a suggestion.
Sure.
I think it would be helpful if staff gathered all of the recommendations and then presented it to this group for discussion, and then an ad hoc committee take that and come up with recommendations for the whole group. Then we would see the recommendation of the subcommittee or the ad hoc board committee, but we'd have the context of all the recommendations and the discussion before we make, before we approve something. Is that possible?
Sure. I don't see why not.
Marcia, just, another just thing to consider, somewhere between constitution of the committee, some of its work, somewhere in the middle, I think there should be a community listening point. And hopefully that wouldn't intersect with the Brown Act, but I think, that broader community input is also valuable in the process.
Thank you. Okay. Do I have any volunteers, other volunteers?
I actually would like to have a staff member participate.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Okay, so I have Elliot, Robin, Susan, and the SO. Thank you. Sounds good. How do we connect now, Marissa? Are you going to drive this?
We'll be happy to, we have technology. So we'll be happy to launch invites to the staff that you have identified, to you first, so we can know which staff you want to assign, and therefore organize meetings and so forth. And yeah.
Is that agreeable? Yes. Thank you. All right. Our next meeting is May 8th, and we stand adjourned. Thank you so much.